Yeah, I prefer standing. That's more, at least I won't fall asleep. Okay. The case of Ukraine is the case where we usually have a number of assumptions that fail when we apply them from the conventional way of thinking when we look at Ukraine from the Western perspective. And one of the things that I would like to show is explain how that happens and why that happens. And let me give you the first example is Ukraine versus the international rankings. When you look at where Ukraine stands in international rankings, you clearly see three different domains. When institutions are measured, Ukraine underperforms. Ukraine is usually between 100 and 150, in some cases 170 out of 200 countries when we measure things like economic freedom, the quality of, for instance, tax office, the quality of judicial system, the quality of law enforcement, etc. Then when we measure infrastructure, Ukraine is somewhere in the middle. It's, in some cases it has pretty high scores that would go, say, I don't know, number 50, 55 or whatever. In some cases the scores are quite low, but I would generally say that they are centered somewhere in the middle. And then if we look at the human capital, that's where Ukraine overperforms. And when we look at human capital figures, Ukraine in some instances performs better than the worst performing countries of the European Union. And generally, Ukraine is somewhere between the first and the second quarter of countries. So what we have is we have bad institutions, mediocre infrastructure, pretty solid human capital. Now, the thing is that if we give it a thought, these things should be kind of in one place, because human capital affects institutions, and institutions affect human capital, but they're not. So here's the question, why are not they in the same place? And the reason they're not in the same place is because human capital is defined to a large extent by the culture. And institutions in Ukraine are defined to a large extent by the colonial past of Ukraine. So what we see is we clearly see a conflict of foreign system of rules that's been imposed on Ukraine and that Ukraine failed to make itself free of them up until now. And then there's the culture that allows Ukraine to actually survive in these conditions. Now, that would be all right, but the problem is that the optics that we judge each other internationally is institutional. So it basically makes the worst option of Ukraine available to any foreign eye that is trying to look at Ukraine and see Ukraine. Now, this was the case, this was the clear case in 1991, 1992, when the Soviet Union, surprise, surprise, collapsed, and surprisingly, very few international observers saw that before that happened, quite similarly to how Russia is being judged now. And when swarms of auditors came to former Soviet Union to provide response for basically two questions. First is, who's going to control the nukes? And the second, who's going to pay the debts? The only data that was easily available to them was institutional data. And then if you look at institutional data, in 1991, the legislation of Turkmenistan and legislation of Ukraine were like twins. However, we know from the last 30 plus years of history that Turkmenistan and Ukraine had quite different ways that they've undertaken. So the question is, how did that happen? Well, the difference was in human capital, which affected the quality of leadership, which affected the motivation of the actors who were making the decisions. The difference was in to a great extent in political culture. And these were the things that could not be identified back then in 1991, 1992, which basically resulted to a very, I would say, stereotypical conclusion that the countries of the former Soviet Union are pretty much the same. Moscow is more developed, it's got more money, it's got more talent. So we, the international community, should adopt a Russia first policy, and then most likely everyone else will follow the Russian footsteps. And that didn't quite work in the case of Ukraine, because a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union and Ukraine becoming independent, Ukraine started showing signals that it's taken its own path, and that path is very different from what Russia is doing. And then Maidan happened in 2004, and many observers were trying to find a way how come this Maidan repeats something in Russia, but there was nothing, there was no precedent in Russia that would that could be treated as a precursor to Ukrainian Maidan. The structure of the Western optics towards Russia is usually towards the former Russian Empire, towards Soviet Union, is usually very Russia-centric. I usually ask Russia and Ukraine experts in Washington, in Berlin, what would be the ratio of the books that they've read in Russian literature and Ukrainian literature. And in many cases, that's something on one hand, and then there's nil on the other. Or how are they merged with Ukrainian culture or any other culture, non-Russian culture of the former Russian Empire. And what we usually have is the kind of bias that is natural because it comes from the past experience that was very Russia-centric without recognition that there is a bias. So when, for instance, a former diplomat who served in Moscow becomes a Ukraine expert, or a former journalist, or this is the case that we very often have right now. Imagine a journalist who represents major Western media, who worked for 12 or 15 years in Moscow bureau, with very professional record. That person is expelled from Russia, and then somewhere in the newsroom, the decision is taken that that person goes to Kyiv. Well, that person comes to Kyiv with its ecosystem of Russian contacts. And this is where we have a number of situations in Ukraine when someone from Kyiv reports something that sounds very fishy from the Ukrainian point of view because it probably represents one of the Russian narratives, not Ukrainian narratives. Lack of recognition of what Volodymyr was saying, that there are land empires, not only sea empires, and that if you look through Russia-centric optics, you may not see the abuse. You may not see things that are huge from the global history perspective, like, for instance, the Holodomor, the famine of 1932-33, which killed millions of Ukrainians. This is a notorious story about the New York Times correspondent who got Pulitzer Prize, who falsified his stories to make sure that he was on the same page as the Soviet authorities wanted him to be, with the Soviet authorities. And his opponent, who was actually trying Garrett Jones, who was trying to reveal the story of the Ukrainian famine, who eventually died, this is one of the early cases of this optics being basically formed. Then the next issue, the next issue that we have is the effect to which the Ukrainian culture is important. The Ukrainian political culture also is built on the foundation of things that we don't really see or don't really understand. Ukraine is an industrialized country, which means that Ukraine is capable of operating in an environment of sophisticated solutions. And Ukrainians are capable of producing sophisticated solutions. This is the country that has had its own rocket industry. This is the country that has had its own aviation production. This is the country that has had its own cybernetics and its own long history of cybernetics. This is the country that has solid academic background. So in that sense, Ukraine doesn't really fit the stereotypical perception of a colonized country. And here are two biases. One is not recognizing Ukraine as a colonized country, or over-recognizing Ukraine as a colonized country, which in its own turn leads to assumptions like Kiev will fall in 3 days. Ukrainians cannot do it. And these assumptions basically are overconfident about the Russian abilities and underconfident about the Ukrainian abilities. The cultural factors are usually the factors that we see, that we can hardly see. Well, first of all, it's kind of difficult to see the culture without being in that culture, without actually knowing the culture from the inside. You can read, if you're professional enough, if you're, and if that's something that you do in your life, you can read the value surveys, but they won't give you a clear understanding of what kind of culture this is. So one of the things that is not usually seen is how Ukrainians form networks and how they form horizontal relations that is contrary to how the Russians form hierarchies. This in its own term is basically based on history. If you look back into, for instance, if you look into the story of the European Union, it's usually the question that I ask my students is, what's the difference between Council of Europe, European Council, and Council of the European Union? And many European voters have problem with that, but the Ukrainians are usually very mixed up with the way how Brussels works. But if you look at the European history from the Holy Roman Empire and the history of Vatican and how basically these relations were developing, you understand that the modern European Union and the way it's governed is pretty logical continuation of the historical discourse of the Western European statehoods. In a similar way, when you look at Ukraine, you understand that Ukraine is a continuation of the historical discourse of the Great Lithuanian Duchy, of Rzeczpospolita, and of Russian Empire, and of the Ottoman Empire, taking different and merging different outcomes from these empires. And one of the important basic factor is the grassroots agency. Those of you who speak Polish, you know that in Polish language, a person is addressing another person without using you as a way to address. You usually talk about person like you would talk about the person in the absence of that person. That is caused by the phenomena that was important in medieval Polish history of having nobility of about 10% of the population. To the extent that part of that nobility was poor and didn't have any resources. But still, when you interact with a person, you have no idea who you interact with. So just to be on the safe side, you choose the most polite way of interacting with a person. This was one of the questions, this recognition of the grassroots agency. So you can be talking to someone who is a peasant of a poor kind, but you give the full credit of the nobility to that person. Well, that recognition of agency was something that the Russian soldiers who occupied north of Ukraine could not comprehend. The question that they usually had to the Ukrainians when they noticed how well run the villages were and how the local people enjoyed the good quality of life, the question that they had was, who gave you permission to live like that? The natural response from the Ukrainian side is, nobody was giving us permission. Why do we have to ask for permission? This grassroots agency comes up, and it's in a sense also a different concept that we have from the West, where the agency was a phenomena that was actually developing top-down. First only the kings, then the nobility, then everyone who had an estate, then all the males, then eventually all the women, and then we have universal suffrage, and we have modern treatment of agency. Not the case in Ukraine. So this grassroots agency is actually quite important if we want to understand where Ukraine's Maidans come from, where Ukraine's grassroots initiative comes from, where Ukraine's guerrilla movement comes from. And these are also things that are not understood in conventional thinking when we look from the West. Then the last thing that I want to tell is the thing that Ukrainians are becoming more and more aware themselves, and this is something that has shocked also the Ukrainian public opinion when the Ukrainian public opinion became aware of the magnitude of the phenomena. This is the historical trauma, which in the case of Ukraine consists of combination of two traumas. First trauma is totalitarian trauma. Ukrainian society has had experience of existing in a totalitarian system for over 3 generations. The totalitarian period of Stalinism was followed by a softer, a milder Soviet autocracy that at any point threatened to move back to totalitarianism, which basically extended the trauma, continued the trauma. Now, Western experience with totalitarian system is 12 years in Germany, 20 years in Italy. That's it. Which means that you can have a V-type renewal where the generation that has been formed under totalitarian conditions can be skipped and the next generation can take the social competences from the previous generation. When you have 3 generations who were brought up in conditions of either totalitarianism or conditions that were threatening to turn into totalitarianism, you have a lasting effect. What does totalitarian system do to you? Well, first is you're dealing with a system of rules that are so strong that you can do nothing about them. In a totalitarian system, the state controls every aspect of your life. It controls what you do, it controls what industry you're in, it controls who you live with, it controls who your family is, it controls if you are alive or not. And if it decides that you're not going to live, there's nothing that you can do about that. It's too strong. It can break any resistance. It sees any agency as its enemy. So, what's your last hope measure if you're trying to survive in a totalitarian system? What would you do? You can't leave, you can't resist. What can you do? You can't bend it.
No, bend like just join
it. Accept. Oh, well, but that's usually equal to death. So what can you do? Excuse me? Oh, you can't. Not for sure. I mean, you can get drunk, and that's one of the reasons why people drink so much in systems like that. But that's escapist intoxication. But seriously.
From my experience, I remember my grandfather. So this was a double life. One life was public life, and the other life that was kind of friends life.
Well, the only thing that you can effectively do is you can corrupt the system. You can try and corrupt the system. Now, what that means is that if you suffered totalitarian trauma, you view corruption in terms of security. So you view corruption as the ultimate security tool that can help you survive in case the system turns against you. Now, if we want to fight corruption, the best tool for that is provide security. And that's exactly what Obama and Biden administration failed to understand, and that's exactly what Angela Merkel failed to understand, and that's exactly what a number of other Western administrations failed to understand. When in 2014 they were forced to act somehow in response to the Russian annexation of Crimea and start of the war in Donbass, corruption was a much more comfortable problem to deal with than security. So they decided to act on the effect, not on the cause. The other problem that Ukraine had, and the other trauma that Ukraine had, was colonial trauma. And what colonial trauma does to you, and in Western discourse, usually there is different understanding of colonial trauma. It's not the trauma of the colonizer, it's colonized, it's the trauma of the colonizer. So when you are being colonized, what happens is a mean of control by the colonizer of the colonized is withdrawal of access to any governance or managerial knowledge from the colonized identity discourse. So if you're Ukrainian in Soviet Union, you had to switch your identity to Soviet, which basically means Russian, if you wanted to get access to any governance or managerial positions. That's still not granted. For instance, if you're Western Ukrainian, you still had glass ceiling over you and you couldn't break it, you couldn't penetrate it. What that means that basically whatever advances you make, they stay in the imperial domain. They don't stay with your discourse of the colonized, which means a perfect storm between two traumas. You have totalitarian trauma, which basically paralyzes you. And then you have colonial trauma, which does not allow you to find the way out. And that's where Ukraine was in the early 90s. And it took Ukraine about a generation to recuperate and to learn to manage itself and to learn to create its own institutions. So beginning 2004 and then after 2014, Ukraine has finally reached the point when it could produce its own institutions and it could govern itself as an independent body. So basically the combination of these two traumas were partially overcome and Ukraine started developing exponentially. Now the problem is that by that time the first impression of Ukraine has been formed in the 90s, and that was of a dull post-Soviet place. So this whole development was either not on the radars, or it was treated as a kind of, I would say, folkloristic local thing that doesn't really change anything. Ukraine is utterly corrupt, Ukraine is badly governed, Ukraine is not capable, and it's not even a real place, as we just heard from Putin and Trump. So, in a sense, these things have formed the number of cliches that are present even in quite advanced thinking. And what we very often see from Ukraine is that we get a statement in support of Ukraine that is full of these cliches. That basically says, okay, well, we support you as long as you stay a subjugated imperial entity. Let me stop here and take your questions in case you have any questions. Yeah.
I think I have a question. I'm trying to formulate it. I'm not sure it's a question or a statement. But I am coming from...
That's very Ukrainian, by the way.
Well, I come also having Ukrainian roots myself. But I actually live in Scotland as part of the UK. And I'm thinking of Gareth Jones, the journalist who challenged the view of the Holodomor that was wrongly interpreted by the police prize winner. Gareth Jones coming from Wales. And Scotland and Wales kind of at the edges of the United Kingdom, as it's called. And so my question is about thinking of the United Kingdom, of England itself, principally, being somewhere that has, and Scotland is absolutely wrapped up in this, and Wales doubtless as well, has a huge colonial history. And so my question is about, you're talking about the optics of Ukraine in terms of its sense of agency as a nation that has is asserting its independence from its history, if you like, from its colonial history, and I speak as speaking from my own perspective, living in Scotland, where we are, and I don't correlate I think the struggle in Ukraine is of a different magnitude, but the idea of agency within a history that is rooted in colonialism is always, is it not? I suppose this is my question. It's always a combination of resistance and creativity, and where is your struggle here has been instigated by violence, the violence of the occupation of
not only occupation.
Okay.
Well, this is Ukraine has problems with every country that Ukraine has been part of its empires, and which means Poland, Hungary, and I would speculate that if Crimea was not occupied, that would also be the case with Turkey. So to rephrase it, I would say it's the agency stupid. It's, that's, this is exactly what's not comfortable, including to modern administrations in Berlin, in Washington. It's much easier to force Ukraine into decisions than to let Ukraine take these decisions in good faith and deal with them. And so what we basically have right now with, for instance, the arms supplies, is that, in fact, there's tremendous negotiating power on behalf of those who supply the arms, and by quantity and timing and the particular way how the supplies are structured, there can be tremendous negotiating power as to whether Ukraine should be forced into some kind of negotiation or some kind of other solution that is not based on the long-term Ukrainian interest. And then it's much more difficult also to explain that Ukraine's interest actually coincides with the long-term Western interest, because basically what it does, it pulls at least the European continent out of the assumption that security is a commodity and it's easily available and you can take it for granted. And it's no longer the fact, partially because the European countries have neglected their own obligation of being strong in order to enjoy security. Partially because the societies have lost the track of their own input into their own security. And as a result, the kind of language that Ukraine uses to wake the West up is not interpreted. So the problem with the optics is not only from the West towards Ukraine, it's also from Ukraine towards the West. But that's a different story, because Ukraine has not been exposed to the extent that, for instance, Ukraine would know how to present itself to be understood, for instance, in Scottish terms, or to be understood, I don't know, in Spanish terms, or in Catalan terms, or in Northern Italian terms, etc. But that's definitely a two-way street. But that's also reflected with the European integration of Ukraine, which from the Brussels perspective is a one-way street, not a two-way street. So it's Ukraine joining the EU, not EU adjusting to the experiences that Ukraine brings in. So this is really important.
Thank you so much.